Okay, so I think this is something that gets conflated all the time. Okay,
Okay.
and you were the one that I remember where I was when you sent me the draft. Okay, and I was
Okay.
like, "Holy shit!" Okay, listen, like you're onto something. Listen, I know you're smart.
The draft of what?
Yeah. Okay, and then that was on when you were like, "Hey, there's a difference between biological accommodation and neurological stagnation." And I kind of like I literally remember I was in Indianapolis working with some linemen, and I literally remember waking up in the morning reading your draft, and I was like, "Whoa!" Like there's yeah, this is a huge concept. And since then, it's really changed how I view not just like training, but also treatment, specifically in regards to like, and this is like a huge topic. So, right, and we're both working in the clinic, so we're not going to have enough time to really go through it in its entirety. But I kind of just want to, I kind of, this is a highly disruptive idea. Okay. A lot of people
Okay.
know that it exists, but they just want to live in denial. Okay. And essentially, I'll have you explain it, right? But everybody talks about like biological accommodation, biological accommodation. You see the Soviets first discussing the biological law of accommodation. It's in their manuals. It's also in Science and Practice of Strength Training, right? But even Science and Practice of Strength Training, first edition came out in 95. If you pick up Fundamentals of Special Strengths 1977, they're talking about it then. So this has kind of been like this has a lot more ground than, the concept that you kind of proposed of neurological stagnation. And the underlying assumption was, you got to understand the lens that the Soviets are looking at it. And then, Louis Simmons obviously propelled that work. He's looking at it from a lift perspective. And he's saying, like, hey, if a lift doesn't go up, it's because you're biologically accommodating, which could be true. But
Sure.
it could also be the nervous system has stagnated. Okay. Which is that's a crazy concept, right? Because it was a lot less complex of a world when we were just thinking, oh, everything's due to biological accommodation, right?
Hmm.
Now that we have this concept of, the neural net of absolute strength, and maybe the neural net is just kind of like, yeah, I've just stagnated. Like it's not that I've
But again, the from a neural net perspective, the prompt is wrong. The prompt is not giving you what you ultimately want, right? Because from the neural net perspective, we did a video on the neural net. I don't know if I don't remember if that's been released or not yet. But if it hasn't been released, it's coming. It's in the to be released pile. But um, the significance of the neural net concept, which we do discuss in more detail in that video, is that um, the network ultimately learns based on um, the connections of the network. So, like how interconnected the network is, and then how well the network can be prompted to use those connections in an effective way to create an output.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, we didn't necessarily have the neural network, you know, framework, sort of, you know, ready once we like when we came out with that neurological stagnation, biological accommodation. Um, but it was very plain, at least in my eyes, and then when we further discussed it, that based on the descriptions of what ultimately was biological accommodation, um, what was being referred to as biological accommodation was an output problem,
Mhm.
and so
Well, hold on. I think
uh,
that's worth repeating.
so so think about the general scenario, or let's just sort of uh, detail the general scenario of what people ultimately would have referred to as biological, like you have accommodated. And generally, and I might be leaving out some things here, but generally people would have said that an athlete had accommodated to particular to the lift. More specifically, they've accommodated to the lift, and the reason they've accommodated to the lift is because they don't see that the numbers that they wanted to be achieving with that lift are actually continuing to increase. So disregard the lift for a second, because the lift does have some, variables in it that may be biological, obviously. But when you see plateaus and you see these things where athletes, lifters aren't achieving what they want on the lift, like that's an output problem. That means that you don't have enough to create this internal mechanism to output a certain amount of effort to try to get through whatever it is that you're trying to get through. So that's ultimately where we came up with the neurological stagnation component. Like when we started to divide training into the different ecologies, and mainly there's a biological ecologies, and then there's the neurological ecologies. It was very plain to see that the biological stuff is not really the output. Like that's not output stuff. That is what the output gets put into. But
Mhm.
more specifically, that biological stuff. And when I say output gets put into, I mean like the muscle component of that ecology. But the majority of the biological stuff is going to be input things, right? And so when you think about the generalization of what people would call accommodation, really what they're saying is that that athlete doesn't have enough inside the nervous system to output a certain level of effort to create ultimately what they want. So that's where we sort of talked a little bit more about the neurological ecology as being the main limiting factor. And so that's where the component of neurological stagnation came in. From there,